This is the second video I've done on the Jordan Peterson-Sam Harris debates. You might want to check out number one before diving in here. In brief, here's where we got to last time. Peterson and Harris both want to be moral realists. They both want to make objective moral judgments about our lives. Some things are better, some things are worse. To do that, they both posit a logos that exists to adjudicate this realm of the flesh, the realm of our biological reality. For Peterson, the logos is the archetypal Christ figure. For Harris, the logos is enlightenment rationality. But actually for both men, their logos is actually from below, and in the end, they therefore cannot escape from the relativism that they fear. In the next videos, I'm going to discuss how Harris and Peterson both get religion wrong. Harrison values religion too little, Peterson values religion too much. Yes, even as a Christian minister, I think Peterson values religion too much, way too much at times. We'll get to that. But here, and for the next three videos, I want to address three serious objections that Harris makes to the Christian faith. There's Old Testament wars, the practice of sacrifice, and slavery. Here's the point about Old Testament war that was raised in the Vancouver debates by the moderator there, Eric Weinstein.
What does that do to Moses' laws of war? This is not a narrative, this is instructions about what to do when you invade a foreign land. If you intend to take over that land, you kill everybody. Right? There are other rules in there about killing husbands and taking the wives for yourself.
Yeah, the Old Testament's a brutal document.
Absolutely brutal. And so my point would be, I don't know that reading that portion in light of the end, even if you call the end the New Testament, I don't know that it changes Moses' laws of war and their acceptability.
What do we do about Old Testament wars? Well, the first thing to say is that I too get a lump in my throat reading the book of Joshua. There is hard stuff here. And it's made so much harder to me by my belief in Jesus. I follow the guy who said, "Put down your sword." But he also said, "Take up this book meaning the Old Testament." It's supremely Jesus who gives me my difficulty in reading Joshua. And actually it's Jesus who gives the West its conscience when it comes to warfare. When Parliament debated whether to bomb Syria earlier this year, there were two very strong arguments, and both of them were thoroughly Christian. There was the more pacifist strain that said violence never solves anything, and that tradition goes right back to Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. On the other hand, the just war tradition that expresses something that basically says, look, sometimes violence does solve things. You know, the state bears the sword, and sometimes there is justification for wielding that sword in a righteous cause. That's a thoroughly Christian tradition, founded in places like Romans 13 and expressed powerfully by Augustine. So you've got these two strains going on. Both sides are thoroughly Christian. And the West, when it comes to warfare, is shaped by the New Testament profoundly. But as I often say, the Bible is such an immense influence on our culture that even our problems with the Bible have been given to us by the Bible. Right? It's the New Testament that has given us a problem with the Old Testament, a problem so-called. Peterson makes that point. He says we have to read these wars in context. It's the way you treat any document. You need to read the story in its context, especially the context of the New Testament.
My point would be, I don't know that reading that portion in light of the end, even if you call the end the New Testament, I don't know that it changes Moses' laws of war and their acceptability in
Well,
any
hypothetically,
modern
if you
context.
take the New Testament seriously, it does. Because it's a document that supersedes it.
The stories of Old Testament wars come in the flow of a grand narrative, and you really need to understand the narrative. You can't come in halfway through and understand it. That would be like coming in at the end of Star Wars Episode 4, seeing the Death Star explode and saying, oh, what a reckless and unjustifiable expression of violence. You know, you wouldn't say that. You need to understand the context. The context is that Israel were David and the Canaanites were Goliath. The Israelites were a bedraggled mob of ex-slaves who go into battle against the military installation of Jericho with a bunch of priests, some temple furniture, and playing the trumpet. That is their strategy. They are pathetic. It would be like Malawi declaring war on the United States and waging war by singing at them. The historical context is that for 400 years, Canaanite cultures were involved in child burning and other grotesque evils. The Lord gave them centuries to repent of it. That's considerably longer than any other just war ever launched. He then, through his people, visited them with a one-off, unrepeatable judgment. It had nothing to do with race. This was not genocide. Later on, when the Israelites were guilty of those same sins, they too were judged in just the same way. Now, when it came to these wars, every Canaanite who ever sought mercy from the Israelites was spared. Now, certainly prior to the conquest, God speaks the language of total destruction, yet Paul Copan and others have showed that this was well understood in the day as militaristic hyperbole. The language of driving out precedes and predominates over the language of wiping out. And when Joshua sums up his achievements at the end of his conquest of the land, he considers that he has done just what Moses has commanded, this in spite of the fact that the Canaanites were not fully driven out, let alone wiped out. So there's context to these wars, but then supremely there's the context of the New Testament, and this is vital. You see, along comes a guy called Joshua. That's what the Hebrew form of the name Jesus is. Jesus is Joshua. He's the new Joshua. He comes to planet Earth to wage war against evil, and how does he do it? Well, for instance, in Luke chapter 19, Jesus, Joshua, right, entered Jericho. Okay, wow, that's evocative. And he annihilated his enemy called Zacchaeus. He annihilated him by making him his friend. And this is the way that the Old Testament pencil sketch is fulfilled. Jesus wars against evil, not with the sword, but with cheek-turning love. And the church inherits his kind of mission. We must not take up the sword. In the Old Testament, there were these pencil sketches, these kings, priests, temples, and armies, portraits of the coming Christ, and in their own contexts, they were just wars, but they picture for us the victory of Christ that is at the cross, and the bloodless army who will fight with forgiving love. That's who the church is. And then the question becomes very interesting, because I, as a Christian now, am very wary of military activity. I wish we hadn't bombed Syria because of Jesus, right? Because of the New Testament, because of the way that the narrative develops. But let's get rid of the Bible. Without the Bible, will you be more willing or less willing to go to war? I'd say you'd be more willing to go to war, because if there is no higher adjudicator between nations and cultures, all becomes about power. And war is the result. Which goes to show that the real problem is not millennia-old wars. It's the human heart today. That's the problem with Old Testament wars. In the next video, we'll look into sacrifice. See you in the comments.